The small group of English settlers who arrived off the tip of Cape Cod in November of 1620 and who are now collectively known as the Pilgrims occupy a unique place in American tradition and history. They are uniformly depicted as men and women, all wearing black clothes, the men in their high-buckled hats and buckled shoes with white linen collars, the women in their crisp white linen aprons and bonnets, all gathered around a traditional Thanksgiving Day table loaded with turkey and trimmings. However, the Pilgrim story begins decades before they landed in what is now Provincetown, Massachusetts. In 1533 through 34, the English Parliament, under the direction of King Henry VIII, passed a series of laws which would formally separate the English Church from the Roman Catholic Church. Almost as soon as the separation had taken place, dissent arose as to which path the new church would take. The king and his advisers made it clear that they wished to retain Roman Catholic forms of worship and belief. However, dissenters wished to push the church in a more Protestant direction, simplifying the ritual and allowing each congregation to choose for itself which forms of doctrine it wished to pursue. By the 1560s and 70s, when King Henry's daughter, Queen Elizabeth I, was on the throne, this group of dissenters had largely coalesced under the umbrella term of Puritan. The Puritans wished to purify the Church of England by ridding it of practices and doctrine which they considered to be too uncomfortably close to Roman Catholicism. However, there were some dissenters who believed that they needed to go further and actually sever ties with the Anglican Church itself, and one such group was under the leadership of a preacher by the name of Robert Brown. It was Robert Brown's teachings that would influence the nucleus of people that we now know as the Pilgrims. Thus, the Pilgrims were not technically Puritans, although Puritans and Separatists often had similar practices and beliefs. However, the Separatists went one step further. They wanted to sever ties completely with the Anglican Church. To be a Separatist in Elizabethan England was a dangerous proposition. Attendance at Anglican church services each Sunday was mandatory, and people who habitually stayed away from church faced heavy fines. Although Catholics, Puritans, and Separatists could worship privately as they chose, they were not allowed to proselytize, publish literature, or form their own groups, and those who did faced potential charges of sedition, if not outright heresy, which carried the death penalty. In the 1580s and 90s, as threats from Catholic Spain loomed over England, the authorities continued to crack down even harder on dissenters and separatists, arresting leaders and raiding meetings. In 1630, when King James I came to the throne of England, he made it clear that he would tolerate no dissent from either Puritans or Separatists, and that he would follow traditional Anglican forms of worship and give the bishops the authority to dictate church doctrine. One group of separatists was located in the town of Scrooby in Nottinghamshire, England, and the leaders of this group decided that the only way that they would ever be able to pursue their religion as they saw fit was to seek exile in a foreign country. They chose the Netherlands because the Dutch had had a decades-long war for independence against Catholic Spain, and the separatists believed that since the Dutch had experienced religious oppression firsthand, that the Dutch would give them asylum and respect their right to pursue their religion. In 1607 through 1608, members of the Scrooby congregation, approximately 150, migrated to the Netherlands and settled in the town of Leiden. And although they found religious freedom, they also encountered difficulties. They did not speak Dutch, they did not understand the local customs, and the men found it difficult to find a job or pursue their trade. The children began speaking Dutch, and younger members of the group began looking to Dutch girls as potential wives. Thus, although the Scrooby congregation had found their religious freedom, they were in danger of losing their English identity. In 1617, members of the group in Leiden returned to London to negotiate with the Virginia Company of London for potential settlement in the New World. The Virginia Company of London had sponsored the earlier Jamestown settlements and had Crown authority to plant English settlements on the North American coast between what is now Cape Fear, North Carolina, and Long Island Sound in what is now New York. Originally, the Leiden group had wanted to settle near the Jamestown settlements in Virginia. However, they decided that it would be in their best interest to settle as far away from any other English population as possible and chose the New York, Long Island area. In 1620, members of the Leiden congregation packed their belongings and boarded the Speedwell to begin their first leg of the journey toward their new home. As they left, William Bradford, who would eventually become a future governor of their colony, described his feelings at leaving one foreign country for a completely unknown life in the New World. Quoting Hebrews 11:13-16, he likened himself and his companions to pilgrims and exiles who were leaving a foreign country to seek yet a new land. It is from Bradford's quote in his diary that the term pilgrim is derived. The separatists themselves did not refer to themselves as pilgrims. Instead, they referred to themselves as saints. They believed they were saints in the sense that they were men and women seeking a holy life on earth while preparing for a heavenly hope or a heavenly resurrection. And they referred to people who were outside their congregation as strangers. The term pilgrim did not come into play to describe this group until the 1790s, long after the Pilgrims had landed. The group in the Speedwell reached England, where the plan was that they would rendezvous with a larger ship called the Mayflower, and both ships would make the crossing together. However, in August of 1620, after 2 false starts, the Speedwell had to turn back. The crew of the Speedwell reported leaks in the ship. However, it was later found out that the crew themselves may have sabotaged the ship because they did not want to make the rough North Atlantic crossing, and they did not want to have to stay over the winter in the wilds of the New World. On September the 16th of 1620, in the port city of Plymouth in Devon, England, 102 passengers and 25 to 30 crew crowded aboard the Mayflower and began the crossing of the North Atlantic that would take them approximately 65 days. Water turned green, the food was rancid, there was constant storms, clothing became moldy, conditions were cramped and uncomfortable, and disease began to spread. The passengers of the Mayflower were composed almost equally, one half being saints and the other half being strangers. The strangers were servants of the Pilgrim families, some laborers sent along by the Virginia Company to help establish the settlement, and an English mercenary by the name of Miles Standish, whose job would be to coordinate the defenses of the colony once it was established. On November the 19th of 1620, land was sighted, and at that point the people on board the Mayflower realized that something had gone terribly wrong. They were several hundred miles north of New York and out of the territory controlled by the Virginia Company. At this point, the strangers on board the ship became restless, fearing that the Pilgrims or Saints would use this opportunity to break away from England entirely and form their own government and or impose their own religious beliefs and religious laws on everyone in the group. To settle tensions down, the Saints and several of the Pilgrim leaders met and drew up a compact known as the Mayflower Compact. This is a brief 3-paragraph document in which both sides mutually reassert their loyalty to England and also both mutually agree that in a convenient future time they would meet and draw up a set of laws from the colony that would be agreeable to both sides. Although this Mayflower Compact is a social compact, the Pilgrims were by no means dealing at arm's length with the strangers. The strangers were their servants, their laborers, and their army of one. The Pilgrims needed to come to terms with them in order for their colony to survive. As soon as they dropped anchor on November the 21st of 1620 in the harbor of what is now Provincetown, Massachusetts, several men from the Mayflower went ashore in search of food. This was vital as most of the food supplies in the Mayflower had run out or had turned rancid. To their surprise, they found an abandoned Indian village with what looked to be intact corn stores. They gathered the corn and took it back to the Mayflower. What the Pilgrims or colonists on board the ship did not realize was that this supposedly abandoned Indian village was a Patuxent Indian village that 2 years earlier had been decimated by a plague, and that although the corn appeared to be abandoned, there was a nearby tribe, the Wampanoag, led by their war chief Massasoit, who considered the village and the corn within it to still be their property. Massasoit would not be happy about the theft. Throughout the winter of 1620 to 1621, the passengers and crew of the Mayflower remained aboard the ship. Most of them were sick, and many of them died. By March of 1621, only 53 of the passengers and about half the crew would have survived. Those who were able to work had gone ashore periodically to search for more corn stores and to begin building a settlement, and they eventually built 4 large common houses and several small outbuildings with a crude stockade. In March of 1621, the remaining and surviving passengers and a few of the crew who were going to stay in the New World moved ashore, and the men of the Mayflower prepared to take the ship back to England. However, the settlers faced a daunting prospect. They had little food and no seed or anything else to plant and to harvest so that they could start life over again in their new world. However, in late March of 1621, an Abenaki Indian by the name of Samoset walked into the Pilgrim settlement and announced in clear English, "Hello, Englishmen." He had had extensive dealings with English fishermen along the North American coast and knew several words of English. However, there was a Native American, who was more qualified to assist the Pilgrims in their new task. This was Squanto, a Patuxent Indian who, ironically, had lived in the village where the Pilgrims had raided the corn stores. The story of Squanto is even as more interesting than that of the Pilgrims. English fishermen had been familiar with the North American coast for more than a century before the Pilgrims landed in Massachusetts. They had fished for cod or herring along the banks of the coast and had traded with the Indians for corn and other supplies. However, some of these fishermen were unscrupulous enough to take Native Americans and sell them in Spanish ports as slaves. Squanto was a Patuxent Indian who had been captured by English fishermen, taken to a Spanish port, and sold as a slave. However, he had escaped, returned to England, and from there returned back to his homeland. It was his village that was the one that was wiped out by a plague, most likely a disease or a contagion caught from these same English fishermen along the coast. Squanto and Samoset lived with Massasoit's tribe and had to obtain Massasoit's permission to assist the colonists. This Massasoit reluctantly gave, believing that these colonists would simply stay where they were and, if not provoked, would either flourish in their settlement or eventually go away. Squanto returned to Plymouth Plantation and began to assist the Pilgrims in establishing their new life. He taught them how to plant corn using herring fish as fertilizer. He also taught them how to fish and how to draw sap from the trees to use for syrup. Without Squanto's help in learning what they could eat and how they could survive in their new world, the Pilgrim settlement would have perished. And it was partly because of his efforts that in October of 1621, the Pilgrims were able to gather for what later became known as the First Thanksgiving. The First Thanksgiving was a lot different from the traditional Thanksgiving that we know of today. It was more of a festival in the nature of a harvest festival. In those days, a service of Thanksgiving did not mean a feast. It usually meant a long church service and even possibly a day of fasting and prayer. What the Pilgrims were observing, what they had brought from England, was a traditional harvest feast where they could celebrate a bountiful harvest. Turkeys were present, although they were probably roasted on spits, and they certainly were not slow-basted in an oven. But also there was wild geese and wild ducks on the menu, as well as shellfish and eel and cod from the beach nearby. Squash and pumpkins featured on the menu, although not in the form of pie. Potatoes and cranberries would not make their appearance until much later in the Thanksgiving tradition. Thus, the Thanksgiving meal, while somewhat similar to what we know today, was very different in a lot of ways. It was attended by the 53 remaining surviving Pilgrim settlers, Massasoit, Squanto, Samoset, and about 90 other Indians of their tribe. It would not be until 2 years later, in 1523, before the Pilgrims would have another opportunity to eat such a bountiful meal again. There were still hardships ahead. However, the Pilgrims deserve their place in American tradition simply for the hardships they faced and the fact that so many times luck or destiny or whatever else one would choose to call it seemed to help them out again and again to start the settlement that would eventually lead to the founding of America.